The room was tense before a single word was spoken. Maps covered the walls, their edges curling from damp air and constant handling. Cigarette smoke hung low, mixing with the smell of sweat, oil, and damp wool uniforms. Outside, artillery rumbled like distant thunder, shaking dust loose from the ceiling beams. Inside, every man understood that the war had narrowed down to moments like this one. General George S. Patton stood near the center of the room, boots planted wide, hands resting on his hips. His helmet was tilted slightly back, polished even in the middle of chaos. His eyes moved slowly across the faces of the captured German officers seated before him. They were tired but not broken. The senior German commander met Patton's stare without flinching. His uniform was worn, insignia dulled by mud and exhaustion, but his posture remained rigid. This was a man who had already accepted how his story might end. Patton didn't raise his voice, he never needed to. His presence filled the room naturally like pressure before a storm. He spoke plainly, directly, offering terms that any rational commander would accept. Surrender, lay down arms, spare the men, end the fighting here. The German commander listened without interruption. Then he answered, "You'll have to kill me." The room went silent. Even the distant artillery seemed to pause, as if the battlefield itself leaned in to hear Patton's response. Several American officers stiffened. They had seen Patton furious. They had seen him merciless. This moment could go in any direction. Patton didn't explode. He smiled. It wasn't warm. It wasn't cruel. It was the smile of a man who understood something had just shifted. The German commander believed defiance would provoke rage, maybe even earn him a dramatic end. Patton did something else entirely. He stepped closer. Not aggressively, calmly, almost casually. He studied the German's face, the set of his jaw, the flicker behind his eyes. Patton recognized it instantly. This wasn't bravery. It wasn't honor. It was a man clinging to control in a situation where he had none left. Patton spoke again, slowly, deliberately. "No," he said, "I won't." That answer confused everyone in the room. Patton turned away from the table, walked toward the maps on the wall, and began speaking not to the German commander, but to his own officers. He spoke about troop movements, about supply routes, about how quickly armored columns could bypass stubborn pockets of resistance. As if the German commander wasn't even there. That was the moment the power dynamic collapsed. Patton wasn't threatening him with death. He was threatening him with irrelevance. Patton explained in vivid detail what would happen next. American forces would move around the German position. They would cut off fuel, food, ammunition, communications. The German troops would be isolated, starved, and forgotten. No dramatic last stand. No glorious ending, just men freezing in holes, waiting for an end that would never come on their terms. He made it sound boring. That terrified them more than any threat. The German commander interrupted, anger flashing across his face. He insisted his men would fight, that they would resist to the last. Patton turned back to him then. "You won't," Patton said. Not loudly, not angrily. With certainty. Patton had seen this scenario too many times. He knew the psychology of collapse. He understood that courage erodes when logistics fail, that ideology crumbles when hunger sets in, that loyalty fractures when survival becomes personal. He leaned in slightly, just enough. "You're already done," Patton said. "You just don't know it yet." The German commander said nothing. Patton straightened, adjusted his gloves, and gave the order to continue operations exactly as planned. He instructed his officers to move on without delay. No executions, no theatrics, no concessions. Just pressure. Relentless, calculated pressure. As the Americans left the room, the German commander remained seated, staring at the maps Patton had described. For the first time, doubt crept in. Not doubt about honor or duty, but doubt about purpose. That was Patton's true weapon. Not violence, not intimidation. Clarity. Patton understood something most commanders never did. Killing an enemy wasn't always victory. Sometimes victory was forcing them to realize the fight was meaningless before the last shot was fired. Outside, engines roared to life. Tanks rolled forward. Columns advanced with mechanical precision. Patton's army didn't slow down. They didn't wait for surrender. They simply moved past resistance like water around a stone. And the German commander watched his world shrink. Within hours, reports began coming in. Supply trucks destroyed. Communication lines severed. Forward units cut off without warning. Every message confirmed what Patton had promised. The war was no longer happening on the German commander's terms. By nightfall, his men were cold, hungry, and confused. Orders contradicted reality. Ammunition was counted carefully now. Morale thinned with every passing hour. And Patton never came back to threaten him again. He didn't need to. The absence was the message. By the next morning, the German commander requested another meeting. This time, his voice was different. The defiance was gone. And Patton, when informed, simply nodded. "Bring him in," he said. The second meeting felt nothing like the first. The same room, the same maps, the same smoke-stained walls, but the air had changed. Where there had once been tension, there was now weight. Heavy, unavoidable reality pressing down on every man inside. The German commander entered without escort this time. His shoulders were still squared, but the stiffness looked forced now, like armor worn out of habit rather than belief. His eyes moved around the room, taking in details he had ignored before. The American officers standing casually, the confidence in their posture, the absence of urgency. Patton arrived last. He didn't rush. He never rushed. He removed his gloves slowly, set them on the table, and finally looked at the German commander again. This time, he didn't speak first. Silence stretched. The German commander cleared his throat. "My situation has changed," he said. Patton raised an eyebrow slightly, inviting him to continue without encouragement. The German spoke about fuel shortages, about isolated units that had stopped responding, about men who had marched for days without hot food or rest. He spoke carefully, choosing words that preserved what dignity he could salvage. Patton listened patiently, hands folded, expression unreadable. When the German finished, Patton leaned back. "No," Patton said calmly, "your situation didn't change. Your understanding of it did." That landed harder than any insult. Patton stood and walked to the map again. He pointed to areas now shaded differently, lines redrawn since the previous day. American units had advanced exactly as Patton said they would. German positions had collapsed inward, folding under pressure that never let up. Patton explained it plainly, not as a threat, not as a boast, as a lesson. "You thought this was about courage," Patton said. "It's not. It's about momentum, and you lost it." The German commander stared at the map. He knew Patton was right. The war had outrun him. His men were still brave, still disciplined. But bravery without supply was just suffering extended. Patton turned back to him. "You told me I'd have to kill you," Patton said. "That was never the question." The German commander looked up, confused. "The question," Patton continued, "was how many of your men you were willing to bury for a statement no one will remember." That broke something. The German commander's jaw tightened. His hands clenched briefly, then relaxed. For the first time, he looked tired rather than defiant. Patton softened his tone slightly, not out of sympathy but strategy. "I've buried enough men," Patton said. "So have you. Let's not add to the count for pride." The German commander asked about terms. Patton's terms were simple: immediate surrender, full cooperation, clear instructions sent to all remaining units to lay down arms, medical treatment for wounded, food and warmth for prisoners. No humiliation. Patton believed humiliation bred resistance. He wanted compliance, not resentment. The German hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I will give the order," he said. Patton extended his hand. The German commander shook it. That moment would never appear in headlines. No cameras, no cheering crowds, just two professionals acknowledging reality. Within hours, white flags appeared where gunfire had been expected. Columns of exhausted German soldiers marched into captivity, relieved rather than ashamed. American medics worked alongside former enemies, binding wounds without comment. Patton watched it all from a distance. To some, Patton was only remembered for aggression, for speed, for harsh language and relentless advance. But moments like this revealed the deeper truth. Patton didn't crave blood. He craved victory, and he understood that victory didn't always come from destruction. Sometimes it came from making the enemy understand the future before it arrived. Patton moved on almost immediately. Another front demanded attention. Another breakthrough waited. He left the surrendered German units behind without ceremony, already focused on the next objective. The German commander would later tell interrogators that Patton had defeated him twice, once with tanks and movement, and once without firing a shot. That was Patton's real legacy. He didn't just break armies, he broke illusions. He showed that wars aren't won by bravado alone. They're won by understanding human limits: hunger, fear, fatigue, hope. When Patton walked away from that meeting, he didn't look back. He never did. The war only moved forward, and Patton intended to stay ahead of it. And somewhere behind him, a German commander finally understood that survival, not defiance, was the last meaningful command he could give. The order went out just before dawn. Not shouted, not dramatized, typed, signed, transmitted, repeated. Unit by unit, frequency by frequency, the German commander's final command moved across a collapsing front. Lay down arms, cease movement, no destruction of equipment, no last stands. For thousands of German soldiers, it felt unreal. Hours earlier, they had been digging, firing, retreating, obeying. Now they were told to stop. Some cried, some laughed. Most simply sat down where they were, exhausted beyond emotion. American units advanced cautiously at first, expecting traps. None came. Instead, they found rifles stacked neatly, tanks abandoned with engines cold, men standing in lines, hands raised, faces hollow but calm. There was no chaos, no panic, just surrender done the way professionals end a lost fight. Patton arrived at the forward command post mid-morning. He reviewed reports, nodded once, and moved on. He didn't tour prisoners. He didn't make speeches. To him, the moment was already over. But the consequences were only beginning. The collapse of that sector opened a corridor faster than Allied planners had expected. Supply routes shortened overnight. Artillery redeployed forward without resistance. Entire American divisions advanced days ahead of schedule. Other German commanders took notice. Interrogation reports began to repeat the same phrase. Patton is coming. Not as a threat, as a fact. Units that might have fought to the last shell instead withdrew earlier. Positions that would have been defended street by street were abandoned to avoid encirclement. German officers began calculating survival instead of symbolic resistance. Patton never announced this effect. He never claimed it, but it followed him everywhere. The German commander who had said, "You'll have to kill me," survived the war. In captivity, he was interviewed repeatedly. Allied officers expected bitterness, excuses, rage. Instead, they got reflection. "He did not insult me," the commander said once. "He did not threaten me. He showed me the future and asked me whether I wanted to be responsible for it." That answer circulated quietly among Allied intelligence circles. Patton's staff understood what had happened. They had seen Patton rage, curse, push men beyond limits, but they had also seen him choose restraint when restraint achieved more than violence. He was not reckless. He was selective. To Patton, killing was a tool, not a goal. And sometimes the sharpest weapon was certainty. Weeks later, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, resistance fractured unevenly. Some units fought fanatically, others folded at first contact. The difference was leadership and memory. Where Patton had been, German commanders knew what delay cost. They knew he would not stop. They knew negotiation with him was not about mercy, but math. Men, fuel, roads, time. Patton always had the numbers. After the war, histories would simplify him. They would focus on speeches, slaps, speed. They would turn him into a caricature of aggression. But those who were there knew better. They knew that Patton's greatest strength was clarity. He saw outcomes before others accepted them. He forced enemies to confront reality before they were ready. That German commander had said, "You'll have to kill me," believing it was defiance. Patton heard it as hesitation. And instead of pulling a trigger, he pulled the future forward and laid it on the table. That is why Patton kept moving while others stalled. That is why fronts collapsed when he arrived. And that is why, long after the guns fell silent, men on both sides remembered the same thing. Patton didn't ask for surrender. He made resistance meaningless. This wasn't mercy. It was mastery.